So just last week, the Wall Street Journal reported a rather disturbing news about the fact that Saudi Arabia is now considering accepting Chinese yuan instead of the US dollar for Chinese oil sales. But to add insult to the injury, Saudi leaders declined to take calls from Biden in the midst of all this. Then Saudi leaders turn around to invite Xi Jinping to visit their country. Looks like Biden's not invited to the party.
Come on, man.
So could this be a staple moment for the US dollar collapsing? Could this give more economic power over to China as the second largest economy in the world? And after this, what are some of the other signs could we start seeing that will continue to devalue the US dollar? We'll definitely unpack all those questions and more. First, let's go and unpack the Wall Street Journal article about the fact that Saudi Arabia is now considering to accept Chinese yuan instead of dollars for Chinese oil sales. Now, this is certainly going to put a dent on the dominance of the US dollar. Now, I know this is last week's news, but there's more to this than you think. Currently, China buys about 25% of all Saudi's oil exports. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but it sure is enough to give the yuan a boost in global trade if Saudi decides to replace the dollar with the yuan. Something I mentioned in the past is that more than 80% of all global trade is done in the US dollar as the world reserve currency, which ultimately requires the countries to work with the US corresponding banks, aka the Federal Reserve. But for the Saudis, they exclusively sold their oil in the US dollar as part of their agreement back in 1974. In exchange, the US will provide guaranteed security for the country. So why is then Saudi leaders are considering selling oil in Chinese yuan when nearly 80% of the world's trade is done on the dollar and their own currency, the rial, is pegged to the US dollar? Could this mean that the Saudi leaders are potentially betting on a collapse of the US dollar and making sure that contingencies are put in place to make sure that they're on the winning team?
I don't want to say I told you so, but I told you so.
Now, what is concerning about this is that Saudi Arabia is number 2 on the list of the largest oil producers of the world, with Russia coming in number 3. If Saudi leaders do side with Russia and China, this could potentially be a huge threat to the security of the United States. A few weeks ago, we published a video that paints a possibility of the US dollar collapsing, what could mean for the world, and how it's connected to the Great Reset. One of the key highlights I mentioned is how the only thing that's protecting the value of the US dollar is the United States military. You see, if it wasn't for our military, both China and Russia would pretty much do whatever the heck they want in imposing their currency to the rest of the world. But because of the US military presence around the world, it deters the other superpowers from acting out. Even in the most recent Ray Dalio's video about the changing world order, it talks about the necessity for an empire to maintain a strong military presence around the world for its currency to be adopted as a global reserve currency. However, a move in which a major oil supplier in the world would side with historical enemies of the United States certainly can undermine the US military. Well, because for most, our jets, transportations, tanks, and weapon systems rely on oil. So if there were to be a war between the United States and Russia/China team, the US now faces a significant disadvantage due to a short supply of oil. And what's ironic about this is that the United States promised the Saudi leaders back in 1974 that the US will provide guaranteed security and protection for Saudi Arabia. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would sell their oil exclusively in the US dollar. But lately, China has been stepping up to help Saudi Arabia in building their own ballistic missiles, consulting them on a nuclear program, and begun investing in Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince's infrastructure projects. If the scenario where Saudi Arabia will break its tie with the United States and void the 1974 deal, it's possible that the Saudi leaders could make a deal with China that would leave the US on the sidelines. Anything that can strengthen the Chinese currency can mean a devaluation of the US dollar as it loses grip and influence over the global trade. Furthermore, China has been putting a lot of effort in building their influence in places like Africa, Australia, and even here in the United States. But what does this mean for the US dollar? Well, for one, I think China understands that countries like Kenya and Ghana are emerging markets and therefore can be exploited by investing into the capital and the real estate markets in those countries. As further influence is built around the world, China can begin taking grasp of the global trade by making sure that their currency is used in those types of countries. So other than the recent Wall Street Journal report, what other potential signs could we see the next few months or years that could potentially lead to a further downfall of the US dollar? For one, the printing of $8 trillion of stimulus funds in the last 2 years did not help the US dollar at all. It's not actually just the last 2 years, it's more like the last 10 years where we've aggravated the value of the US dollar. So it's likely as further decline of the US dollar to continue, the Federal Reserve might print more money to stay afloat for a little longer. And yes, you're hearing it from this video, I'm predicting that the Federal Reserve is going to print more money in the next 2 to 5 years. But this type of response from our central bank may cause more concerns in the capital markets where foreign investors may lose confidence in the US and begin taking money out of the US economy over to other markets. Or alternatively, we may see a massive adoption of cryptocurrency as a more sustainable way to transact instead of the US dollar, which only pushes a further decline of the US dollar even further. All that will lead to the US dollar becoming pretty much near worthless, which ultimately translates to the US government's inability to fund their own war machine. Currently, the United States spends approximately $754 billion per the 2022 fiscal year alone. If the US government can't fork over this money and we continue to see a divestment of capital out of the US, this is going to be a certain blow against the United States military, which subsequently means that the other superpowers can now project their military power onto the world. Internally, we can certainly see unemployment numbers skyrocket, the stock market near non-existent, and ultimately leading to an internal conflict right here in the United States. Now friends, I'm hoping none of these events would unfold here in the United States, and I certainly hope our leaders will carefully steer the nation out of the harm's way.
I'm not confident in changing behavior. What do you do all the time?
But with agendas like the Great Reset and many of the poor choices we've seen by our leaders, our confidence is kind of waning at this point. However, there is a glimmer of hope that China won't overtake the US as the #1 economy, just as many may say. Last week, we published another video as to why we don't necessarily think China will overtake the United States as the most powerful economy in the world. So for that, click on this video right here to hear our take on the changing world order, as well as our commentary on how China may not overtake the United States.